Hi, Misha here, and kind of still looking at the starships of the Federation, Starfleet, and this little look where I talk more about head canon or beta canon, and kind of positioning in a video game or, you know, Starfleet battles, FASA type thing. I don't know, just hanging out, talking. Why not? Having fun. And we've looked at the TNG ships inspired by the galaxy. Then did a couple of videos on the TMP era, first the Enterprise looking ships, then the Excelsiors. And now we're going to go back and talk about the Enterprise NX era, so the 22nd century ships, and just kind of where they fit in. Again, just kind of having fun, frankly. And with that, let's talk about the earliest one we have here. This is the Conestoga class or type, or as some places like Star Trek Legacy call it the Discovery class. And really this is a 21st century ship. We see it in the first season of Enterprise, in the Terra Nova episode where it's an early colony ship. It is, of course, warp capable. It's not a sleeper ship, yet it was slim enough that it still took a decade to get to its target, which was, about 20 light years away. And it carried a crew of roughly 200 colonists. It was meant to be disassembled once at its destination. In my headcanon, and this kind of goes back to the old encyclopedias of the late 80s and 90s, this also looks very much like the SS Valiant mentioned in the second pilot of TOS, which was a deep space explorer. It would make sense that this design would not just be as a colony ship. They could use the space frame for deep space exploration, maybe early cargo missions, science missions, and just because it could hold 200 colonists, that wouldn't necessarily mean that was the standard crew. We can infer from that it was relatively big, and it's also pretty thick as far as the decks. Based on its transit time, we can estimate it had a speed of about warp 1.5 to 1.6. Has kind of the old school nacelles with the spikes on the ends. Pretty boxy design. We've got a small deflector dish here. We have old school chemical engines in the back instead of later impulse. Even though this is a 21st century design, we know that several freighters in Enterprise are quite old, so it's possible these are still chugging around the space lanes. I don't know. It's a really neat ship. I'm super glad Eaglemoss did it. And I just had to include it here. The little model itself is relatively good size, but it's relatively light because of all the detail on the hull. A lot of it is plastic. This part's metal, but of course the nacelles and whatnot, and a lot of the detailing is plastic. But it kind of shows the early Starfleet design of kind of a box with a pointed front and then nacelles hanging off the back. So yeah, in my headcanon, we can call this the Discovery type if we like, or Discovery class. And I would put the Conestoga here is the same class as the Valiant. It all fits in quite nicely. In an early effort, chances are these would only have enough armament for defense, so maybe early plasma cannons, or even just lasers for, shooting space debris out of the way. We do know that the crew had some armament because we see it in Terra Nova, pistols and rifles and the like. Because again, they were going to an alien world, so who would know what they would find. But in a game setting, this would be obviously a colony ship would be primary thing. Also transport, also maybe an early scout reconnaissance vessel, but certainly not a warship. Here we have another very neat one that Eaglemoss did. Now, the Conestoga over there, that was a special or bonus edition, but this was actually in the standard edition, which is kind of interesting. But since it was in a couple of episodes, even kind of premierly highlighted, why not? This is officially called Archer's Toy Ship, seen in the pilot episode of Enterprise. Broken Bow. It's also seen in the episode in Season 3 with the Sim clone of Trip. But we kind of know from behind-the-scenes notes and sources that it was based on a real spacecraft, even though it was a model in the show. As most models are, they're based on real craft. And this is described as an early Starfleet transport. And it has kind of nozzles in the back that look more like advanced chemical rockets versus impulse, but it still has warp nacelles. We don't really know a size, but it looks like it would be, kind of analogous to the modern day, or at least the used to be modern day space shuttle. So probably able to carry a few dozen, maybe 12 to 24 people total, with a crew of at least 2 in the front. So yeah, an early Federation transport, maybe from Earth to the far out solar systems or a nearby colony, if the warp were fast enough. We really don't know how fast it is, but it's a toy that Archer played with in the early 22nd century, so it's probably made around the turn of the century. And it honestly looks like a sleek space shuttle, yeah, with warp drives attached. So maybe capable of warp 1.5, just, more refined version. And to, transport people a few days, maybe get warp enough to get to something nearby. You got to think about it, that even going from Earth to Pluto without warp would take a very long time, so that might even be good just to warp to the outer solar system. So in a game sense, this is pretty small. This would definitely be a good light transport or a scout ship, reconnaissance ship. No evidence that it was armed. But I'm really glad Eaglemoss did this because, again, it was pretty prominently featured in the 2 episodes it was in. At least it was kind of the center point for a few frames. And they did a very good job. It's a good size again. Nicely laid out cockpit. And this one is much more metal. It's really only the warp nacelles being plastic. And it fits right in with the fleet. This is kind of what I mean by fitting in with the fleet. Seen in the opening of Enterprise. We never get an official name for this, but the ship is usually called the SS Emmett. So we could call it the Emmett class. Why not? It's also sometimes been called like the Moon Shuttle. And it seems to be another early warp ship. We have early warp nacelles. We have kind of the same angular hull like the Scout we just looked at. And even looking a lot like the Conestoga, just a lot more refined and sleek. And we have still chemical engines versus impulse. Kind of my headcanon or beta canon notes said this is about 130 meters long, has a crew of about 30, has plasma cannon, no evidence of torpedoes, although it could have had something, and probably is about warp 1.8, maybe warp 2, kind of in that range to the next step forward. It's again a kind of a sleeker take. It really harkens back in a way to the Phoenix with its overall shape. Has very wide swept up pylons. But this would seem to be an early 22nd century Starfleet ship, probably a frigate or light cruiser, an escort craft, something to help maintain some discipline against pirates and what have you for Earth's burgeoning colonies. So it must be fast enough to at least get to the nearest habitable star systems, and it probably have some security duties and just, overall work duties within the Sol system. Again, we don't really know much about this, but we do see it a lot just because it's in the opening credits of Enterprise. And I think it fits in quite well. We see the deflector right here at the nose. But it does blend the old school shapes with the newer Starfleet ones. Next up, we have a very similar ship. This is officially just known as the Warp Delta, although unofficially, sometimes it's referred to as the Ganges class, which I kind of like. And it's said that maybe even the SS Emmett over there was retrofitted or upgraded to this style. The pylons are a little bit different. The nacelles look a little more updated, so we can assume it's a little bit faster, maybe as much as Warp 3. Still the same basic hull design. We have a more of a pronounced bridge module, kind of and more of a pointed, rounded nose. But the biggest update is we have impulse now. And we have a impulse engine exhaust here. We have the manifold and crystal here. So that means it's going to have a lot better sublight performance than the previous class. We do see these in action in Enterprise. We know that they have phase cannon, whereas the earlier ships probably had plasma cannons or plasma weaponry. Now these are having phase. Still no evidence of torpedoes, though. In the series, we see these being used for kind of system planetary defense. But at this point, this would definitely be a light cruiser or frigate. It's still about 130 meters with a crew of roughly 30. And it's kind of the last in this lineage of an angular hull with warp engines hung off the back, which kind of gives us an idea of the first 100 years or so of Starfleet starship design, getting sleeker and sleeker. But there are limitations to this shape for just being able to do things. But keep in mind, these vessels would probably have to land in atmospheres, hence the shape, because these were all made before transporters were a thing and organic human rated. So when these vessels were made, they still had to rely on either shuttles or docking or landing on a planet. So that could excuse and explain part of the shape to the ships to this point. But yeah, I really like this one. It's another one that I'm super glad Eagle Moss did. It's kind of a love it or hate it ship, but I like it because it's very different, but still recognizably Starfleet. And in a video game, this would be a great little light, relatively inexpensive support unit. Probably nothing extraordinary, but a good ship you could spam and produce. It has a relatively low crew requirement. And we see it being able to fight Klingons in the series, so it's not hopelessly obsolete. And we do know by this point it has the ability to have polarized hull plating and all of that. Next up, we have one that I almost didn't include here because I'm sticking to kind of frontline ships, but I decided to include the Arctic one. transport for a couple of reasons. We see this in space in several episodes, at least a variant of this without the skis installed and painted more in gray. Like, for example, we see it during the Welcome Home thing for the Enterprise at the beginning of Season 4. So it's obviously a spacecraft. We also know that it is capable of Warp 1.4. So, not going to get to another solar system, but it's going to operate inside the solar system. At least this version. Maybe ones that aren't Arctic transports can have faster. It still seems to retain more of a chemical rocket look in the rear. Although it could just be a round impulse manifold, since we do see it moving. It's about 50 meters long, so not tiny. And while it has a crew of 4, it can carry up to 24 passengers. So all in all, it can carry near as many people as the Emmett and Ganges types. It's unarmed, but it does have polarized hull plating. I don't know, I just felt like including it because it has its own hull shape, but again, it does kind of have the Starfleet aesthetic going on. This is very much a research craft, a science ship. So in a game setting, that's exactly what it would be. Again, a planetary survey craft, a resupply ship, a science sensor ship, something along those lines. A specialty item, but again, we know there's a variant without the skis that does the space thing, so I would imagine in those instances it was used more of a transport. Getting people to and fro. It does have a noticeable bridge module too. Sorry, I always do that, I don't know why. Here. Of course, add a little Borg and you can do wonders with it. This seems to be part of the fleet regardless. And so I thought I'd bring it out real quick just to give it a little dessert. Also, this model is quite neat from Eagle Moss. It's actually very heavy. Kind of wish they did the version without the skis, though, to be honest with you. But, you know, little extra detail never hurt, right? And now we move into kind of the modern ships here. And as I've said in every video that I've shown this one in, the one that I really wanted Eagle Moss to do, and as it got put off longer and longer, I got afraid they wouldn't do, the Sarajevo class, or Sarajevo type. Some say this is the NC type, because it has the registry of NC-27. Just like NX-01 is the NX class. Either way, I really like this ship, and they really did this model justice. For one thing, it's one of the biggest. It's also mostly metal. The underside's partially plastic. Of course, the nacelles are plastic. But what an odd-looking ship. And some say it doesn't really seem Federation. And to that, I completely disagree. If you look at the Emmett type and the Ganges, this has the same kind of hull shape. They just folded the warp nacelles in, kind of Defiant style. And if you think about it, around this time, the mid-22nd century, they would be experimenting with different hull designs. And this map presents some advantages. Easier to work on the engines, sleeker. This would look like something that could still enter into an atmosphere. Again, since we know this is pre-NX, it was probably pre-mainline transporter, so this would be something that could still relatively come into an atmosphere. It's still somewhat aerodynamic, streamlined. And it was probably one way to deal with the whole situation. And it seems to have kind of a modern look. It's quite large too. It's about 200 meters long, and based on the silhouette, we can say it has multiple decks. It actually seems to have a a ton of space. I actually think it will look better this way. This just being the up. But I do believe this is considered up. Looks pretty good this way too. Officially, this is kind of known as an elite observation craft, but we've seen it used for several roles. Passenger transport, science research ship, even something like maybe a yacht. So it definitely seems to be not as much combat oriented and more in kind of the human resources, cargo, freight, transport, observation, obviously. It would have modern features like phase cannons, and if not photonic torpedoes, at least spatial torpedoes. And it would have relatively modern warp, probably something in the line of Warp 4. And this would be kind of a modern, based on its size and girth. I think this could be a candidate for a colony ship, kind of like the Conestoga. So in a game setting, it could do that. It could also be just kind of a multi-purpose science ship that could be configured. But it would also probably have some combat capabilities. We see this in the Welcome Home fleet as well. And it really is kind of the culmination of the arrowhead or delta shape. About as sleek as you're going to make that design. But for whatever reason, they kind of stopped here. But yeah, I think it really adds to the whole fleet. I don't know, it's different, it's unique. And again, Eagle Moss did a bang-up job with this model. And say what you will about Enterprise, I just kind of like the look of this era of ships. They have a certain practicality to them. Kind of like maybe Babylon 5 ships that just seem believable. We never really have an episode focusing on the ship. It's just a background ship, but it's nice to have one. And this is really when we see the advantages of CGI being available for the Enterprise team. They wouldn't have to kit bash. They could actually make new designs with little to no fuss. I mean, I'm not saying CGI models are cheap to make. They certainly are not. But when you compare it to real practical models, especially on a weekly TV show budget, it gave them the ability to really flesh out the Starfleet that wasn't available, say, with the original series or even Next Generation. So yeah, love it or hate it. I know people will take both sides, but I really like it, and I think you almost did a great job. And if you were doing a 22nd century video game, I think you would have to have this in there. To me, it's just neat. I don't like the name Sarajevo. And now we come to the first saucer series, or rather, half saucer. And we don't have an official name for this class, but we do know one of them is referred to as the SS Intrepid. So, based on that and no other contradictory info, we can call this the Intrepid class. Although I've also seen it referred to as the NV class, as in TUVX. But yeah, this is very clearly an immediate forerunner of the NX with the deflector and the cutout section of the saucer. We just have a half-cut saucer with impulse exhaust and manifolds here on the sides. And the saucer, you can really see how we went from the delta shape, if you think about it, to this. It's like we just took the delta and we rounded it off some and stuck a bit of a star drive in the back. I think it's a really neat progression. Another thing I'm not really sure about are these fins. But hey, whatever. The engines are quite large compared to the size of the ship. an overhang. We don't really know a lot of specs about it. It's maybe roughly 165 meters, a crew of maybe 50 or 60. It does have phase cannons and spatial, maybe later photonic torpedoes. And it does have transporters, but when it was made, it'd be assumed that shuttles were still the primary transport method. We have a pretty noticeable shuttle bay in the back. It certainly has a clunkier look, but it certainly is a step towards the NX and eventually, of course, the whole Constitution look. And we see this in more than a few episodes of Enterprise, first in The Expanse, and then during the Twilight episode, where Malcolm is the captain of it. And it's, of course, in the home fleet. This one would seem to be a medium cruiser. Probably Earth's first true deep space cruiser, at least Warp 4, maybe even faster. Probably its first starship as such in the modern sense. So yeah, a little clunky, a little less elegant, but still probably a lot more capable than previous designs. And we can assume that these were still very much in service and use during the Romulan wars of the late 2150s. And again, it's another love it or hate it design, but as I've told the story, when I heard that they were doing the Intrepid in the Eagle Moss collection, that was one of the many triggers that really got me to want to go ahead and buy into the collection, and I'm glad I did. Just kind of secondary ships like this really excite me. Everyone's going to do your Enterprises and whatnot, but it's hard to get neat little models of these ships. And it's not huge, but, you know, it's big enough as a good example piece, and they did a very good job with it. This is metal. Press the back here. Plastic. So in a game setting, this would probably be your medium battleship. Relatively powerful, relatively fast, but not the newest and sleekest technology, but a good standby and probably not near as expensive to produce as our next ship. And if you're going to do any kind of Enterprise era, I just keep doing that, I don't know how to do that, I apologize. If we're going to do an Enterprise era, you'd have to have this in. It's just way too much part of the fleet. And really is kind of a forerunner of what's to come. And of course, I mean the NX class, the Enterprise class. Even though this is a very early one, and a very one that you knew Eagle Moss would do, they did a bang-up job with this model. Even in the Excel edition, I think it's one of their better efforts. It's pretty much all metal. Has that kind of glossy paint, shiny. As I've said in other videos, some accuse this of just being a ripoff of the Akira, which, you know, to be fair, it does have a lot in common with the Akira. But, you know, also to be fair, the Enterprise, the Constitution, the Excelsior Enterprise, the Ambassador, they all have something in common too, so it's just a lineage. I would actually give them credit for seeing a fan favorite like the Akira and working it over and kind of making it an older style and making it the hero ship of a series. I think it works out really well, and it's not at all the same. Like, you have the engines, the nacelle swept up and not down. You don't have the big pod on top. You have kind of this section in the back as opposed to straight off. I think it is plenty different enough, plus the whole new texture and size. As we all know, this was Earth's first Warp 5 ship. It would be probably Earth's first quote-unquote heavy cruiser, or actual combat-capable ship, although it left space dock with only spatial torpedoes, later upgraded to photonic torpedoes. It mounted 3 phase cannons, one of the first ships to do so. It actually could achieve about Warp 5.06 and it could cruise at warp 4.5, so quite a bit faster than previous designs, and later refits would bump that up closer to warp 6. And it was the first of many, with Columbia being the second, and then Challenger, Discovery, and so on, named in honor of the American space shuttle program. And one would hope there might be an SS Buran to acknowledge the Soviets' contribution as well. It's about 225 meters long, and based on the size of the full saucer, that actually gives quite a bit of space for its crew of 80, although during the Xindi incident, we know that Makos were on board, giving the crew over 100. Has 7 decks. Of course, we know a lot more about it because it was the hero ship. We have the primary deflector here at the front. This was one of the first ships to have a transporter as a primary, transport option, although it still had shuttle pods. This would be the frontline ship in the 2150s and up through the 2160s. It would have been frontline during the Romulan War of the late 2150s. But we do know these were pretty time-consuming and expensive to produce. It would actually be one of the last designs created under Earth Starfleet before the Federation was founded in 2161. We also know that the Enterprise herself was severely damaged, still existing, during the Battle of Chiron in around 2160, towards the end of the Romulan War. And while she was not completely junk, she was damaged so severely that it was decided just to go ahead and retire her after her 10 years of service and make her into a museum ship, giving way for newer technologies. But yeah, really neat model, really neat ship in my opinion. As I've said in other episodes, while it was very far from perfect, I still was a big fan of Enterprise. And it was really just getting good when it was canceled. It's one of those great shames. But c'est la vie. But this would definitely be, for this era, the heavy cruiser warship of the fleet if you were building it in a video game. And also very much the fastest. And we know from kind of future sets that it could be refit with shields too. Of course, it primarily used hull plating. So yeah, the NX class or the Enterprise type. And our final little ship today, the Bonaventure class. Don't feel bad if you don't recognize this one. It is definitely a Beta Canon ship, first appearing in 2006 in the Ships of the Line calendar, and it's been made soft canon by little models like this. This isn't a standard issue, this is one of the bonus issues because it's a concept ship, but I think it fits in so very well with the fleet. This is said to be kind of the next leap forward after the NX class, following the Romulan War, where it began in the 2160s, and these were being built and used in the 2170s. And obviously it's very much like the NX, but it's streamlined in the back quite a bit. We have nacelles, more like later ships. We have a saucer. We have a star drive kind of integrated into the center line of the saucer, with the rear section here reminiscent of later Constitution, and then a shuttle bay in the back here, more like a Connie. By this time, transporters would have been very much in common use. And we have a more TOS style deflector here. So yeah, this was an effort by designers, creators to bridge the gap between the NX and the Constitution. And I think it looks really neato. I could definitely see something like this being a hero ship or a secondary support ship. I could also see something like this kind of turning into something like the Miranda later. But this would have been a heavy cruiser replacement for the NX. It was said to have a lot newer technology, more modern computer systems. It would be a Warp 7 ship, having more modern weaponry, possibly even early phasers, certainly photonic torpedoes. We don't really know much about it again because it wasn't officially canon, but I just couldn't resist bringing it out because I like the design. One fun fact, a secondary or beta canon says that Tobin Dax worked on this, and that he looked at human, Earth, space designs, Vulcan designs, and Andorian designs, and decided that of the three design aesthetics that humans, their design was the most flexible. And this would have been one of the first designs created with input from other members of the Federation, not just Andorians and Vulcans, but also, say, Tellarites and maybe Trill or whoever else. But it would have been one of the first unified, true Federation-type ships. And I just like that whole concept. Now, the Bonaventure herself, the name's been mentioned ever since the animated series back in the 1970s, so it's not a new name. Of course, back then it looked like an over-ripened watermelon that was about ready to explode, so I think most people would agree this is a visual improvement. And there's a little bit of contradiction in canon about what and where, but we can just agree it was one of our first true deep space exploration ships of the Federation period. It would have been in frontline use before, say, the Constitutions came online and what have yous. So I just felt like including it here as the wrap-up of the 22nd century. So if we're still talking in a game setting, this would maybe be a very advanced at the top of the tech tree, experimental prototype cruiser, heavy cruiser, or even super starship like the later Excelsior. And I think its name of NX 1000 or NCC 1000 is kind of a gentle nod to the Excelsior, this being the Excelsior of its day and time. And probably about the same size and everything as Enterprise with a slightly bigger crew. So with that, let me know what you think. Do you like it? I know this isn't one seen very often, but it's really neat that Eagle Moss did do it. And again, pretty much all metal except for the nacelles, so it's got some pretty good weight and size to it. And there we have another one of these little fun beta canon ramblings. In case you haven't checked out my earlier ones, yeah, they're around if you feel like it, if you liked it. Fun thing too, when this came out as a bonus edition, the Enterprise F came out, and it was said that it looked like Eagle Moss might have mixed up the acrylic stems for these, and after swapping them around, I would tend to agree. This is the one that actually came with the F, and it seems to hold the Bonaventure a lot better. So yeah, looking at the series, I think there's certainly a continuity here, one I really appreciate. What do you think? I really like the Conestoga, and I think the whole looking at the fleet through the Emmett and the Ganges, we're going to call them that since they don't really have official names, up through the Sarajevo and the Intrepid, up to the Enterprise, really gives kind of a couple of competing designs. And the aesthetic for the saucer style versus the angular hull style seems to have won out after the advent of transporters and faster warp. And looking at the Bonaventure, yeah, this seems to have been borne out. But yeah, I really like this era because of CGI now being apparent. They were able to really work with it and come up with some neat new stuff. So let me know what you think in the comments. With that, I'll let you go. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.